The midwife was certain it would be a girl. She'd delivered enough babies on the dusty farm surrounding Waco, Texas, to trust her instincts. And so when Henrietta Miller's labor pains began on October 12, 1919, the midwife prepared herself for the arrival of a daughter. But babies have their own ideas about the world. And when the child emerged into the dim lamplight of that sharecropper's cabin, strong, lunged, and defiant, he was unmistakably a boy. By then, the name had already been chosen. Doris. The midwife shrugged. Henrietta smiled through her exhaustion. And Connery Miller held his third son and knew that names meant less than the content of a man's heart. The Miller family worked a 28-acre cotton farm that didn't belong to them. That would never belong to them, no matter how many sunrises they greeted with aching backs and calloused hands. Connery and Henrietta had 4 sons total, and each boy learned early that survival meant contribution. Young Doris, who everyone would soon call Dorie, grew up with cotton bolls stuck to his clothes and red Texas dirt under his fingernails. He learned to cook from his mother, standing on a wooden crate to reach the stove, learning the alchemy of turning scraps into sustenance. He hauled water, fed livestock, and when the day's work was done, he'd hunt squirrels with a .22 rifle, bringing home meat for the pot. The Great Depression descended on America like a biblical plague, but for sharecropping families in Central Texas, desperation wasn't new. It was inherited, passed down like the ragged work clothes and the understanding that the world was not designed for your comfort. Dorie attended Moore High School when the harvest allowed it, his massive frame making him a natural fullback on the football team. At 6 feet 3 inches and over 200 pounds, he was a force on the field, using his strength to punch through defensive lines to create space where none existed. But strength alone couldn't overcome the arithmetic of poverty. He started 8th grade on January 25, 1937, at 17 years old. He repeated it the following year. The numbers and letters swam before his eyes when his body was screaming for rest, when his mind wandered to the fields that needed working and the family that needed feeding. School was a luxury they couldn't quite afford, and Dorie knew it. He dropped out, filled his days with odd jobs, squirrel hunting and a correspondence course in taxidermy, dreaming of a world beyond Waco's city limits. He applied to the Civilian Conservation Corps, one of President Roosevelt's New Deal programs designed to put young men to work. They rejected him. He tried the Army next. Another rejection. But the Navy, desperate for bodies if not for equality, would take him. On September 16, 1939, less than a month before his 20th birthday, Doris Miller walked into the Navy recruiting station in Dallas and signed his name. He wanted to see the world. He wanted to send money home to his mother. He wanted dignity, even if he had to sail across an ocean to find it. What he found instead was a segregated service that viewed black men as inherently inferior, suitable only for the most menial labor. The United States. Navy in 1939 operated under a rigid racial caste system that would have made the architects of Jim Crow proud. Black sailors could serve as mess attendants, stewards, or general service personnel. They could cook, clean, shine shoes, and serve meals to white officers. They could not man the guns. They could not navigate the ships. They could not lead other men. The Navy's logic was explicit and cruel. Black men lacked the intelligence, the courage, and the moral fiber for combat roles. They were servants in uniform, and that was all they would ever be. Mess Attendant 3rd Class Doris Miller reported to the Naval Training Station in Norfolk, Virginia, where he spent 8 weeks learning how to properly serve a meal, how to press a uniform, how to make a bed with hospital corners. He learned to say yes, sir, with his eyes lowered, to move through spaces without taking up too much room, to swallow his pride like bitter medicine. When training ended, he was assigned to the ammunition ship USS Pyro, and then on January 2, 1940, to the battleship USS West Virginia. The West Virginia was a behemoth of American naval power, a Colorado-class battleship displacing more than 32,000 tons, bristling with 16-inch guns and armored thick enough to withstand most of what the world could throw at it. For Doris Miller, it was a floating city of contradictions. He worked in the officers' mess, serving food to men who would never eat at the same table as him. He did their laundry, collected their dirty clothes, scrubbed their dishes, and in his off hours he became the ship's heavyweight boxing champion, his fists earning him respect that his skin color could not. The West Virginia was stationed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, that stunning natural harbor on Oahu's southern shore where the Pacific Fleet made its home. Palm trees swayed in the tropical breeze, and the water sparkled like crushed sapphires. But paradise had always been selective about who got to enjoy it. For Dorie Miller and the other black sailors, liberty meant segregated bars and beaches, meant knowing which parts of Honolulu welcomed them and which did not. Still, it was better than Waco, Still, he could send money home. He woke at 6 in the morning on December 7, 1941, the day that would transform him from invisible to inevitable. Sunday morning, the fleet's quietest time, when officers slept late and the pace of military life slowed to a gentle tide. Miller served breakfast in the officers' mess, then went below decks to collect laundry from the junior officers' quarters, a task that earned him a few extra dollars. He was in the lower decks, arms full of dirty uniforms, when the world exploded. The first torpedo struck the USS West Virginia at 7:57 a.m. A Type 91 aerial torpedo launched from a Nakajima B-5N bomber piloted by a crew from the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi. The explosion ripped through the ship's port side like the fist of an angry god, the concussion waves slamming men against bulkheads, tearing pipes from their moorings, flooding compartments with seawater that swallowed sailors whole. Miller felt the deck heave beneath his feet, felt the ship shudder and groan, heard the shriek of tortured metal and the screams of men who would not see another sunrise. The alarm for general quarters split the air, a klaxon wail that meant battle stations, that meant war, that meant every man to his post. Miller dropped the laundry and ran, his heart hammering against his ribs, his mind trying to process what his senses were reporting. Through the passageways, past men bleeding and stumbling, past fires already beginning to lick at the ship's interior. He ran toward his battle station, the anti-aircraft battery magazine amidships, the ammunition stores for the guns that were supposed to keep Japanese planes at bay. When he reached it, the magazine was destroyed. A second torpedo had blown it apart, had turned his battle station into a twisted grave of metal and smoke. Miller stood there for a heartbeat, understanding dawning like a second explosion in his chest. The ship was under attack. Pearl Harbor was under attack. America was under attack. And his assigned post no longer existed. He ran to Times Square, the central point aboard the ship, where the fore-to aft and port-to starboard passageways intersected, and he reported himself available for duty. An officer, his face smudged with soot and his uniform torn, grabbed Miller's massive shoulder and pointed. "Start carrying the wounded to safer positions," he shouted over the cacophony of explosions, machine gun fire, and the roar of Japanese planes overhead. Miller moved through the chaos like a man possessed by purpose. The ship was listing, tilting to port as seawater flooded her compartments. Oil from ruptured fuel tanks spread across the harbor's surface, some of it already burning, creating a hellscape of fire and water that no training manual had prepared him for. He found sailors trapped under debris and pulled them free with his bare hands. He found men bleeding from shrapnel wounds and carried them in his arms like children, their blood soaking into his uniform. He found unconscious sailors in flooded passageways, the water rising to their chins, and he dragged them to higher ground, to safety, to life. Through the smoke and the screaming, through the thunder of explosions and the staccato chatter of machine guns, Dorie Miller saved lives. He didn't count them. He didn't pause to consider his own safety or the color of his skin or the limitations the Navy had placed on what he was allowed to do. He saw men who needed help and he helped them. It was that simple and that profound. Then Lieutenant Commander Doris Johnson, the ship's communications officer, spotted Miller and recognized immediately what the moment required. Strength and plenty of it. "Miller," Johnson shouted, "come with me. The captain's been hit." They climbed through the damaged ship to the conning tower on the flag bridge, the elevated position where Captain Mervyn Sharp Benyon commanded his vessel. What they found there stopped Miller's breath in his chest. Captain Benyon lay on the deck, his uniform dark with blood, his abdomen torn open by a fragment of shrapnel from a bomb that had struck the nearby USS Tennessee. The shrapnel had essentially disemboweled him, a wound that no amount of courage could overcome. Miller knelt beside his captain, this man he had served meals to, this man who represented the Navy's hierarchy and its contradictions. Benyon's face was gray with shock and blood loss, but his eyes were clear, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of command. "Leave me here," he said. "Take care of the ship," but Miller and Johnson ignored the order, as sometimes subordinates must when following orders would mean abandoning humanity. They lifted Benyon as gently as they could, trying to move him to a more protected position, trying to get him away from the exposed bridge where Japanese planes were still strafing and bombing. The captain was heavy with the weight of mortality, and Miller felt every pound of that burden as they maneuvered through the wreckage. They found a sheltered spot behind the conning tower, placed the captain on a cot, and tried to make him comfortable. A pharmacist's mate appeared, took one look at Benyon's wounds and shook his head almost imperceptibly. There was nothing to be done. The captain was dying, and he knew it. And still he refused to leave his post. He lay there on his cot in extraordinary pain, asking questions about his ship, giving orders to defend her, fulfilling his duty unto death. He would later receive a posthumous Medal of Honor for his leadership that morning, for staying at his post, despite mortal wounds, for choosing his ship over his own survival. Miller stood on the bridge, the smoke so thick it burned his lungs, the noise so loud it felt like the world itself was coming apart. He could see the Japanese planes, their meatball insignias bright against the morning sky, diving and banking and strafing, their machine guns spitting death. He could see the harbor where battleships were sinking and burning, where the USS Arizona had exploded in a fireball that killed more than 1,000 men in an instant. He could see sailors in the water, some swimming for shore, some floating face down and spreading slicks of oil and blood. And he could see the unmanned Browning .50 caliber anti-aircraft guns. Their previous operators dead or wounded or fled, sitting silent while the enemy owned the sky. Lieutenant Frederick H. White, junior grade, was at one of the guns, loading ammunition belts and firing at the planes overhead. White looked over, saw Miller, saw a man who had proven himself under fire, and he didn't see a mess attendant. He saw a sailor who could help. "Miller," White shouted, "get on that gun." Doris Miller had never been trained on the Browning .50 caliber. The Navy had never deemed it necessary to teach a black mess attendant how to operate weapons of war. The Navy's position was clear. These men were not fighters, they were servants, and servants did not need to know how to kill. But Miller had watched the gun crews during drills. He had observed, curious and careful, filing away the information even though he wasn't supposed to need it. And now, with Japanese planes filling the sky and death raining down on Pearl Harbor, that curiosity became salvation. He took his position at the gun, his large hands gripping the handles, and White shouted instructions over the roar of battle. "Load the belt like this. Charge the weapon. Lead the target. Short bursts." Miller absorbed the information in seconds, his mind sharp despite the chaos, his football instincts kicking in. You read the field. You anticipate the play. You move before the defense expects it. He opened fire. The gun bucked against his shoulder, hot brass casings ejecting in a glittering arc, the smell of cordite mixing with the smoke and the salt air. Miller tracked the Japanese planes across the sky, leading them the way White had shown him, firing in controlled bursts to manage the heat and the ammunition. The Browning's distinctive hammering rhythm joined the symphony of violence that was Pearl Harbor under attack. And for 15 minutes, Doris Miller became what the Navy said he could never be, a warrior. Later, there would be debate about how many planes he shot down. Navy records would credit him with 1 confirmed kill. Witnesses would claim anywhere from 4 to 6. Miller himself would say he thought he hit at least 1. The exact number mattered less than what the act represented, a black man, untrained and unrecognized, stepping into a role that white supremacy had forbidden him, and performing it with deadly effectiveness. He fired until the ammunition ran out, until the gun fell silent and his ears rang and his hands shook. Only then did the order come to abandon ship. The USS West Virginia was settling to the bottom of the harbor, her list increasing, her fires spreading, her fate sealed. Miller helped more sailors over the side, watched them drop into the oil-slicked water, and then he was among the last 3 men to leave the ship. He jumped, hit the water, and swam through the burning oil, diving beneath the flames when necessary, surfacing to gasp for air, making for shore with the strength that had carried wounded men and manned guns, and refused to surrender to the chaos. He made it. 646 of his shipmates did not. Of the West Virginia's crew of 1,541 men, 106 were killed in the attack and 52 wounded. Captain Mervyn Benyon died on his bridge, still commanding his ship. Admiral Isaac C. Kidd was killed aboard the USS Arizona, which took a bomb to her magazine and exploded in the most catastrophic single loss of life that day. Across Pearl Harbor, 2,403 Americans died on December 7, 1941, and another 1,178 were wounded. The Pacific Fleet was devastated. 4 battleships sunk, 4 more damaged. The United States was at war, and Doris Miller went back to doing laundry. The Navy's initial response to Pearl Harbor included a list of commendations for heroism. Among them was mention of an unnamed black mess attendant who had manned a machine gun. They didn't identify him by name. They didn't rush to pin medals on his chest. The institutional racism that had confined him to the galley in the first place now worked to keep his heroism anonymous, to prevent a black sailor from becoming a symbol of something the Navy's leadership feared: equality. But the black press in America was hungry for heroes, and when they heard about the unnamed mess attendant at Pearl Harbor, they went hunting for his identity. The Pittsburgh Courier, one of the most influential black newspapers in the nation, investigated and published the truth on March 14, 1942. The hero was mess attendant second-class Doris Miller. The story exploded across black communities, from Harlem to Houston, from Chicago to Los Angeles. Here was proof, tangible and irrefutable, that black men could fight, could lead, could be heroes if only they were given the chance. The NAACP took up Miller's cause. Black churches organized letter-writing campaigns. Politicians, both black and white, began demanding recognition for this sailor who had embodied the best of American courage while his own country denied him basic dignity. The pressure mounted until even President Franklin Delano Roosevelt could not ignore it. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, who had publicly opposed black sailors serving in combat roles, recommended against awarding Miller the Medal of Honor. Knox's position was ideological and indefensible. Recognizing a black hero too highly would undermine the segregated structure of the Navy. Better to give him something lesser, something that acknowledged his actions without challenging the system. But the public outcry was too loud to dismiss. On May 11, 1942, Roosevelt approved the Navy Cross for Doris Miller, the third highest medal for valor in the United States military. The ceremony was held on May 27, 1942, aboard the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, anchored in Pearl Harbor. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, personally pinned the Navy Cross on Miller's chest, while cameras clicked and newsreels rolled. Miller stood at attention, his face composed but his eyes revealing the complexity of the moment, pride and pain, recognition and resentment. Honor shadowed by the knowledge that this medal didn't erase the segregation that had tried to limit him. Nimitz's words during the ceremony were telling. This marks the first time in this conflict that such high tribute has been made in the Pacific Fleet to a member of his race, and I'm sure that the future will see others similarly honored for brave acts. The phrasing was careful, almost patronizing. A member of his race. As if Miller's heroism was exceptional precisely because of his skin color, as if bravery was somehow surprising in a black man. The Navy Cross citation read, "For distinguished devotion to duty, extraordinary courage and disregard for his own personal safety during the attack on the fleet in Pearl Harbor, territory of Hawaii, by Japanese forces on December 7, 1941. While at the side of his captain on the bridge, Miller, despite enemy strafing and bombing and in the face of a serious fire, assisted in moving his captain, who had been mortally wounded, to a place of greater safety, and later manned and operated a machine gun directed at enemy Japanese attacking aircraft until ordered to leave the bridge. Miller was promoted from mess attendant second class to mess attendant first class. Later, the Navy would promote him to ship's cook third class. He was moved from collecting laundry to working in the galley. The Navy's message was clear. Heroism was commendable, but it didn't change your place in the hierarchy. You could save lives and shoot down planes, but you were still cooking meals and serving white officers. His image appeared on a Navy recruiting poster in 1943, his face stern and determined beneath the words "above and beyond the call of duty." The Navy used him to recruit more black sailors, promising them the opportunity to serve their country while carefully avoiding any promise of equality. In February 1943, the title mess attendant was changed to steward's mate, a cosmetic adjustment that did nothing to address the underlying system of racial oppression. From December 1942 to January 1943, Miller was sent on a war bond tour, the first African-American allowed on such speaking tours with white war heroes. He traveled to Waco, to Dallas, to the Great Lakes Naval Training Station, where he addressed the first graduating class of black sailors. Crowds gathered to see him, to touch his hand, to hear him speak. He was a living embodiment of the Double V campaign that black Americans were waging. Victory against fascism abroad, victory against racism at home. But the celebrity was a burden, and Miller felt it acutely. In a letter to the Pittsburgh Courier, he wrote with cautious optimism, "You have opened up a little for us, at least for the ones who were following me, and I hope it will be better in the future." He was aware that his heroism had created a crack in the wall of segregation, but he also knew how slowly institutions changed, how resistant to progress they could be. His mother, Henrietta Miller, spoke at a Unity for Victory rally of 6,000 people in Harlem in June 1942. Her words carried the weight of maternal pride and prophetic challenge. "Some say we colored people have nothing to fight for. We all have something to fight for. We have freedom to fight for. But we can't fight this war by ourselves. We've got to put Jesus into it, for he has never lost a battle." According to his brother, Miller confessed the psychological toll of his fame. "My life is a holy hell. The white folks never did like me because I'm colored. Now the colored guys aboard ship do not like me because they say I think I'm somebody special." He was caught between worlds, too celebrated for comfort, too constrained by the Navy's racism to find real peace. He became convinced that his next deployment would be what he grimly called a suicide expedition. On May 15, 1943, Miller reported to Puget Sound Navy Yard in Bremerton, Washington, where he was assigned to the newly constructed escort carrier USS Liscome Bay. He was promoted to cook third class on June 1. The Liscome Bay was part of Carrier Division 24, a baby flat top designed for convoy escort and close air support during amphibious operations. The ship had a crew of 960 men, and Miller went back to working in the galley, cooking meals for sailors who saw him as both hero and servant, icon and invisible man. The Liscome Bay sailed from Pearl Harbor on November 10, 1943, bound for the Gilbert Islands as part of Operation Galvanic, the American offensive to seize Macon and Tarawa atolls and push deeper into the Central Pacific. The ship supported the invasion of Macon, providing air cover as soldiers of the Army's 27th Infantry Division fought ashore. By November 23, Macon was secured, and the Liscome Bay's crew prepared for Thanksgiving. The cooks, Miller among them, broke out the frozen turkeys they'd brought from Pearl Harbor, looking forward to a taste of home in the middle of the Pacific. They never got the chance to cook them. At 5:10 in the morning on November 24, 1943, the day after Macon fell and the eve of Thanksgiving, the Liscome Bay was cruising near Butaritari Island when a single torpedo from the Japanese submarine I-175 struck the carrier near the stern. The torpedo hit the aircraft bomb magazine, and the resulting explosion was catastrophic. The ship's own munitions detonated in a chain reaction that tore the Liscome Bay apart from the inside, a fireball that consumed metal and flesh with equal veracity. The carrier sank in 23 minutes. Of the 960 men aboard, only 272 survived. 646 died, including Rear Admiral Henry M. Malinix, the commander of Carrier Division 24, and cook third class Doris Miller, who was 24 years old. Miller's parents were informed that their son was missing in action on December 7, 1943, exactly 2 years after Pearl Harbor. The Navy officially declared him dead on November 25, 1944, a year and a day after the sinking. His body was never recovered. He rests somewhere in the Pacific, along with hundreds of other sailors who gave everything for a country that gave them so little in return. A memorial service was held on April 30, 1944, at the Second Baptist Church in Waco, sponsored by the Victory Club. On May 28th, a granite marker was dedicated at Moore High School. These were the rituals of grief, the ways communities try to hold on to their heroes, to make meaning from sacrifice. But Doris Miller's legacy extended far beyond memorials and monuments. His actions at Pearl Harbor became a rallying cry for the desegregation of the United States Armed Forces. If a black man could fight this well, this bravely, this effectively without training, what could black soldiers and sailors accomplish if they were given real opportunities? The question haunted military leadership and civilian policymakers alike. In May 1942, the same month, Miller received the Navy Cross. Robert Lee Thornton was sworn in as the Navy's first black petty officer. By 1944, the Navy introduced an officer training program for black sailors. These were small steps, grudging concessions to the pressure building from black communities and their white allies. The war's manpower demands made segregation increasingly impracticable, and Miller's example made it increasingly indefensible. President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981 on July 26, 1948. Officially desegregating the United States Armed Forces. The order declared, "It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin." The implementation was slow and uneven, resisted by officers who clung to the old ways, but the principle was established. And when historians trace the roots of that change, Doris Miller's name appears again and again, a man who proved through action what rhetoric had long denied. The honors accumulated over the decades, each one an attempt to write the historical record, to acknowledge what should have been obvious from the beginning. In 1973, the Navy commissioned the USS Miller, a Knox-class frigate, making it only the fourth Navy vessel named for an African American. The ship served with distinction until its decommissioning in 1991. Schools, parks, community centers, and buildings across the country bear Miller's name. In Waco, the Doris Miller Memorial stands on the banks of the Brazos River, a 9-foot bronze statue unveiled on December 7, 2017, in Pearl Harbor. A commemorative plaque honors him at the Doris Miller Park housing community, dedicated on what would have been his 72nd birthday. The National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, includes a plaque in its memorial courtyard. On December 18, 2014, the Department of Veterans Affairs named the VA Medical Center in Waco after him. On January 19, 2020, the United States Navy announced that a new Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carrier currently under construction would be named the USS Doris Miller CVN-81. It will be the first aircraft carrier ever named for an African American, and the first name for a sailor honored for actions taken as an enlisted man. The ship is scheduled for commissioning in January 2030, nearly 90 years after Miller manned that gun at Pearl Harbor. In 2010, the United States Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp featuring Miller as one of 4 distinguished sailors. Poet Gwendolyn Brooks wrote, "Negro Hero 1945 from Miller's perspective, giving voice to the complexity of his experience." In 2002, scholar Malefikite Asante included Miller in his list of 100 greatest African Americans. Representative Eddie Bernice Johnson proposed bills in 2016, 2017, and 2020 to authorize the Medal of Honor for Miller, recognizing what many believed from the beginning, that his heroism deserved the nation's highest military decoration. The cultural representations of Miller's story reflect America's ongoing struggle to reckon with its racial history. Actor Elvin Havard portrayed him in the 1970 film Tora. Cuba Gooding Jr. brought him to life in the 2001 film Pearl Harbor, though the Hollywood treatment softened some of the harder truths about segregation and discrimination. The 2019 film Midway depicted his Navy Cross ceremony. National Geographic's erased World War II Heroes of Color focused on Miller and his fellow black messmates, trying to restore to the historical record the contributions that mainstream narratives had minimized or ignored. What these memorials and monuments in movies sometimes miss is the essential tragedy at the heart of Doris Miller's story. He was a hero, yes. He was brave beyond measure, selfless in the face of death, effective in combat despite being denied the training that should have been his right. But he should never have been in a position where extraordinary heroism was necessary to prove his basic humanity. He should have been able to enlist in a Navy that recognized his worth from the beginning. He should have received combat training as a matter of course, not learned how to fire a gun by observation and desperate necessity. He should have been promoted based on merit, not held back by the color of his skin. He should have survived the war, come home to Waco, married, had children, lived a long life where his heroism was just one chapter in a full and dignified existence. Instead, he died at 24, his body lost to the Pacific, his potential unfulfilled, his sacrifice extracted by a nation that demanded everything from him while offering conditional acceptance in return. The Navy Cross was an honor, but it was also an indictment of the system that had tried to make him invisible. The true measure of Doris Miller's legacy is not the medals or the monuments, though those matter. It's the way his story forced America to confront the bankruptcy of its racial mythology. If white supremacy was correct, if black Americans really were inherently inferior, incapable of courage and leadership and excellence under pressure, then Doris Miller's actions on December 7, 1941 should have been impossible. But they happened. Witnesses saw them. The evidence was irrefutable. And once that crack appeared in the ideological foundation of segregation, it could not be sealed. Other black soldiers and sailors pointed to Miller's example and demanded their own chance to prove themselves. The Tuskegee Airmen, the 761st Tank Battalion, the 92nd Infantry Division, these units and others served with distinction, accumulating a record of achievement that made segregation increasingly untenable. The civil rights movement that would transform America in the 1950s and 1960s drew strength from the wartime service of men like Doris Miller, who had given everything for a country that owed them everything in return. When you stand before the bronze statue in Waco, or read his name on the hull of an aircraft carrier, or teach his story to a new generation of students, remember this: Doris Miller was not a mess attendant who became a hero. He was a man of extraordinary capability who was forced to serve as a mess attendant because his country's racism would not permit him to be anything else. His heroism was not the exception that proved the rule. It was the revelation of how many other heroes America had wasted, had ignored, had lost to the machinery of oppression. The midwife thought he would be a girl and gave him a name that the world mocked. But Doris Miller took that name and made it synonymous with courage. He took the limitations imposed on him and shattered them with his bare hands and his indomitable will. He saved lives that the Navy said weren't his to save. He fired guns that the Navy said he shouldn't touch. He became a symbol that the Navy tried to suppress but could not contain. He was a son of Waco, a sharecropper's boy who dreamed of seeing the world. He was a football player who understood that sometimes you had to lower your shoulder and drive forward through resistance. He was a boxer who knew how to take a hit and keep fighting. He was a cook who turned scraps into sustenance, who understood the alchemy of transformation. And on one terrible, beautiful morning in December 1941, when the world was on fire and death rained from the sky, Doris Miller was exactly what America needed him to be: unbreakable, undeniable, and utterly, defiantly free in the only way that mattered: free to choose courage over safety, free to choose service over self-preservation, free to prove that heroism knows no color, only character. The Japanese planes have long since fallen silent. The fires at Pearl Harbor burned out decades ago. The men who fought that day have mostly passed into history, joining the honored dead in whatever peace awaits beyond this world. But the story of Doris Miller endures, a reminder and a challenge, a mirror held up to America's conscience. We named an aircraft carrier after him, and that matters. But what would matter more would be a nation that never again demands that its citizens prove their humanity through extraordinary sacrifice, that recognizes worth before it requires heroism, that extends dignity as a birthright rather than a reward for exceptional service. Doris Miller earned his Navy Cross. America is still earning the right to claim him as its son. The story doesn't end. It continues in every sailor who serves today in a desegregated Navy, in every officer who leads without the burden of racial barriers, in every young person who looks at Miller's example and sees possibility rather than limitation. His legacy is written in the lives he saved and the future he helped create, in the battles he fought both against the enemy abroad and the injustice at home. He was a hero. But more than that, he was a man who deserved better than the world he was born into, and who, through his actions, helped make that better world possible for those who followed. That is the highest form of heroism: to suffer injustice and still fight for justice, to be denied dignity and still preserve it in yourself and fight for it in others, to know the system is rigged against you and still give everything to protect it because you believe, despite all evidence to the contrary, that it can change. Doris Miller believed. And because he believed, because he acted, because he showed what was possible when courage met opportunity, America changed. Not as fast as it should have. Not as completely as justice demanded. But it changed. And somewhere in the Pacific, where the water is deep and the light never reaches the bottom, where a young man from Waco rests with his shipmates from the Liscome Bay, there remains a truth that transcends death and time: that a man's character cannot be judged by the color of his skin, that heroism cannot be segregated, that dignity cannot be denied forever, and that some names, given by midwives who thought they understood fate, become prophecies of an entirely different kind. Doris, a name that meant nothing until it meant everything, a name that now stands for all the forgotten heroes, all the untold stories, all the men and women who served with distinction in the face of discrimination, who fought 2 wars at once, who won both, and who changed America in the process. Remember him. Tell his story. Teach it to your children, not because he was perfect, but because he was human. Not because his heroism was unique, but because it revealed how common heroism could be if we only gave everyone the chance to show it. Not because the Navy Cross made him special, but because he was always special. The Navy just took 70 years to figure it out. Doris Dorie Miller, born October 12, 1919, died November 24, 1943, hero of Pearl Harbor, first black recipient of the Navy Cross, a man who saved lives, shot down planes, and helped save a nation from the worst parts of itself. He started as a mess attendant. He became immortal. And his story, like all great stories of heroism and sacrifice and the long arc toward justice, is still being written in the hearts of all who refuse to accept the limitations that others try to impose, who fight not just for victory in battle, but for dignity in life, who understand that the greatest courage is not the absence of fear, but the presence of conviction. The midwife was wrong. Doris Miller was exactly the person he was meant to be, and America is still trying to be worthy of him.